All right. Here we go. Hey, this is Have a Good Time. I'm here with Evan Zimmerman. I've been talking you up on the other ones just a little bit, not to put the pressure on, but, just say hello and whatnot.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here. So you gave me a couple of talking points before we came.
Yeah. I just pitched a couple of, I don't know, softballs or curveballs at you. I don't know exactly how they relate to each other, but...
So what I've been thinking about the last couple of hours as I've been going about my day is the Jungian shadow.
Yeah.
And metals such as gold or silver, other things used as currency. And you
Yes.
bring up these kinds of things every once in a while.
Yes.
So these are familiar subjects. And they're interesting to me because they're not like my subjects. They're not the things that I think about day to day. But I feel like they're related to it. They're kind of like my shadow.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. That's a good start. So, it's interesting. I should say as a preface that we are anybody listening to this should not take anything that we say on this podcast with any just remember that we're just guys talking on the internet. We're not psychologists or anything like that. So that's just a little disclaimer up front. But so specifically the concept of the shadow is kind of new to me. I guess I've seen iterations of it or depictions of it in like pop culture for a long time, and I've even sort of like minus the jargon surrounding it, sort of done what I am now sort of describing as integrating the shadow, in my life prior to knowing anything about it in any sort of like technical sense. So I heard Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you know who that is or not.
No, I don't.
He's a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and he's like he sort of got internet big for he was like giving a speech outdoors at some campus event, and some social justice warriors showed up and were like trying to shut him down, and he was like trying to have a conversation with them and was confronting them, and they were having this back and forth, and so he got sort of internet famous because of that, and but now he's like all over the internet. People are interviewing him on their podcasts and everything everywhere, and he's a really intense dude, and he's like one of his like focuses academically is young, and so he talks a lot. He's like goes really in depth with those ideas, but I heard him sort of mention offhand just watching some lectures online that him sort of mentioning integrating the shadow, and there's kind of two different concepts of what the shadow is, and I think from the it's sort of I think what's his name Freud kind of introduced the idea, and he specified it, if I understand it correctly, as the part where like the dark part of human personality exists, and it is like part of the unconscious, but it's like specifically it's specifically the sort of like what like culturally we would describe as like the dark side of human personality, and Jung had sort of a broader definition of it, and his conception was that it's sort of the inverse of our like of ego identification. So if you say I like the example that I heard was like if you say I like vegetables, I like or let's say I'm a vegetarian, for instance, then the part of you that would identify with that is part of the ego, right? So it's like I am a vegetarian, and so then anything that sort of challenges that you might also like, like maybe you or like maybe you like meat or cheese. I guess maybe vegan is a better thing to do. Then but maybe you don't maybe you can't recognize to yourself that I really like cheese. I especially like cheese, or something like that. So that that idea has to be sort of pushed away, but it's still there to some degree, So it can be as benign as that, right? So it doesn't necessarily include all of the like what we sort of culturally consider negative aspects of our personality. It's a broader definition. Anything that's like that we don't identify with us, but that's still kind of part of us, is included in the shadow or gets pushed into the kind of unconscious,
Yeah, that's kind of how I understand it too. I think of it as Freud has this idea that there is this dark side that affects everyone, and in some ways it's as much a part of you as the part you consider yourself, because
Right.
you make choices not just on the positive aspects of what you want to achieve, but all the things you don't want and all the things you consider to be not you.
Mm-hmm.
Those are sometimes even a bigger influence on you than the things that you think are you.
Right.
And Jung took a look at this and said, yeah, this is really true, but this is just part of a huge category of things that affects people. It's not just the really dark stuff. That there are other things that have that same kind of negative pull on us as that real dark core that we would consider that classic evil.
Right.
There's a lot of neutral things out there that have this negative pull on us by pushing us away from them.
Mm-hmm. And you could even say that a negative pull on us, maybe just a negative pull on or something that conflicts with our conception of ourselves, our conscious conception of ourselves. So like yeah, like I could say, I'm a dog person or whatever, right? But then the cat, I meet a cat that I really like. That sort of conflicts with, my conception of myself as like, oh, I prefer cats to dogs. But if I really sort of examined that, I would realize, oh yeah, okay, there are, I tend to like more dogs more often, and but there are some cats that I like better than some dogs, So it like the conception or the sort of like the way that I would identify as that is is not accurate, but it sort of has some utility, and so like I guess like the idea of integrating the shadow in that specific case would be to say, not to say I'm no longer a dog person, but to say, like I guess what I just said, which is like, I like more dogs more often, and sometimes cats are okay too. Or I accept about myself that I'm open to liking cats, or
Yeah.
like So I mean that's a pretty like benign example, but then once it does cross over into sort of some of like the darker aspects or of the personality, something like cruelty or I don't know, what are some other, I guess like maybe deviance is not the right word, but like sexual stuff that's like kind of like taboo or something, then that it becomes a little harder to integrate, and a lot of it is a lot of it's not just stuff that you don't identify, or the opposite or the inverse of what you don't identify with, but the stuff that you're trying to avoid, like looking at about yourself so anyway, I don't know.
But there are some situations where a lot of people are so defined by what they're trying to avoid. I mean, I could use like the stereotype of what it's like to be a Catholic, where you're going to confession all the time and talking about your sins constantly. Mm-hmm. And there's this stereotype that, like Catholics are just like continually obsessed and caught up in their sins, and they just kind of accept it. they're people that are in some ways more accepting of flaws than other groups that might have a less strong view on what is a sin because they're so defined by their sins. They're so defined by that obsession with the things that they're doing that they don't want to be part of themselves. You know, what they want to be their shadow isn't necessarily something that they don't do or something they don't enjoy. It's something that they're trying to push away from their identity and trying to separate from themselves. But it's in some ways like the most alive part of them because it's that part that gets all the focus. It's that part that's like right on the edge of me or not me. And it's being pushed around. You know, sometimes it's closer and sometimes they're in it and sometimes they're pushing it away. But it's dynamic. It's not like these parts of themselves that are like fixed and unchanging.
So you're referring to sin? Is that, maybe I missed that part?
I think sin is a lot of ways like a manifestation of the shadow. It's like these things that you don't want to be a part of yourself.
Right. Which is maybe why it's such a powerful concept within Christianity, and why there is so much focus on it. You know, or so much focus on avoiding it. Right. I mean, like that. I guess my experience was so I went to like a lot of different kinds of churches when I was younger, just, you know, like with friends or just kind of exploring stuff. And a lot of some of those, there's just a pretty just kind of a cornucopia of different brands and flavors of Christianity that I was sort of like interacting with all the time, which I think in a lot of ways is good, and actually in most of those instances, I would say it was kind of encouraged. Not like leave our church specifically, but like the people at the Methodist church, while we're at this Baptist church, they're kind of like our brothers still. It's like they're or our cousins maybe you could say. So they're so a lot of times going back to the sin idea is that like a lot of times it was like there was this big focus on sin. We need to eradicate sin, we need to hate sin, and there's like a lot of talk and focus and sort of like working through about sin in your personal life. And then a lot of other places it was kind of like more I guess you would say like a quote unquote positive attitude towards we want to live a life of love and loving our neighbor and acceptance and that sort of thing. And then on the sort of the other side of that, the people who were talking a lot about sin actually had specific criticisms of people who weren't addressing that problem. So it was kind of like sin was there on one hand and prevalent and focused on, and on the other hand it was maybe not consciously ignored, but it wasn't focused on. And then there was that sort of bridge that was like this is something that needs to be addressed by a wider group of people. So it's interesting.
That's kind of like the classic split between different types of churches. Like you have the more conservative ones that are very focused on a legalistic, in some ways, interpretation of things. Of course, they wouldn't say legalistic, but they're very specific about the details and like an unchanging thing. Mm-hmm. And those people tend to like focus on sin. And then there's people that are more liberal and focusing on let's just be positive and let's put everybody in a good place because we want to get people deeper into connection with these ideas. And the way you're going to do that is by giving them reasons to be happy. Mm-hmm. And those things are always at odds with each other. And I don't think we've ever really resolved that, not just in religion, but in culture too. And what I was thinking about when I heard you talking about the Jungian shadow is specifically internet culture, because I'm a technology guy. I spend a lot of time observing people, like how they behave in real life, but also how they behave online. Yep. And I think there's kind of a real push toward the prevalence of the shadow with the internet and the way people communicate and identify themselves.
Oh, interesting.
Because there's kind of a shallowness and superficiality to your identity on Facebook or Instagram or anything else.
That's right.
You throw your identity into kind of this collective thing where everything is kind of reduced to a currency in a way, likes. You get this kind of currency, whatever it is, there's a version of like in any kind of social network.
Yeah.
And you're kind of reduced to a number, and even if you're not chasing it, like even if you're not chasing money is a big force on your life, even if you don't really care that much. It's something that affects you. In the same way, online, that kind of social currency, even if you're not focused on it, it still affects you.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the fact that it has kind of a shallowing effect, I feel, on people's individuality, what happens is the part of yourself that you consider to be yourself gets reduced in importance compared to the things that you don't want, right? Because if you start getting negative reactions to things and you start being in this position where it's not just the likes, but it's also the comments.
Yeah.
Like you can't quite quantify it, but there are positive and negative currencies to go along with comments. And when you say something that creates a lot of controversy, and especially gets a lot of negative reactions, that's going to affect you really strongly. Whereas the positive stuff is almost reduced to a number, right? So you have this really intense negative reaction, but the positive stuff becomes just, I got 27 likes on this, and it's simple.
Or a certain kind of comment, like,
yeah,
you go girl, or,
right.
That's awesome, bro, or whatever it is,
They're
It's
simple.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
So what happens is I feel like the shadow, that part of yourself that's not part of yourself, becomes a much bigger shaping force on people's identity. Like, people react more negatively to stuff on the internet than they do in real life. Like, you can bring up a subject and they might not get that mad about it, but you bring it to the internet and people are like intensely angry and they're willing to like show it. Yeah. Now you could say maybe they're just hiding it in real life to be polite, but I feel like it's really bringing out a lot more negativity toward things that you are against.
Yeah, and not only that, but there's or I guess as an extension of that, I think that there's even some incentive to pile on. If you see somebody else being kind of like a little more aggressive, first of all, you don't have the immediate social feedback of people looking at you askance for whatever, yelling at your kid in the supermarket or something like that. People have like sort of like a physiological reaction that you can measure, like with your eyesight and the way your ears and stuff like that. So, but when you do it online, you see somebody sort of do that piling on thing, which is like at the end of what was it? A Brave New World, where all of the sort of like this sort of like lower classes of people, or however that have been programmed, they show up at this guy's home where he's like escaped to, and they find where he is, and it ends in this spoiler alert, like this sort of like blood-soaked frenzy, it's like feeding frenzy almost of like, and it's horrible, and it almost has this like almost kind of like a sexual aspect to it, and it's disturbing. And I think like people see that, it's like you see somebody, people see somebody gone after, and this like hunter instinct that we have as humans, like we're like the Earth's dominant species, so like we have this sort of like dominating influence, and we're tribal. So it's like the internet, social media, that sort of hits all of those like markers in the sort of like, I guess, animal side of our nature, which I think is part of the shadow. It's like
Exactly.
It's like the thing that we left behind, that we're kind of like striving to get away from, in a sense. It's like behind us. It's kind of like our shadow, like the our animal nature. So like you see somebody gone after on the internet, and it clicks on those levels, and you don't have the immediate negative feedback of someone going, who may have a problem with that, the sort of piling on, and so you feel inclined as a tribal creature to join your tribe of, like ideologically your tribe, and be like, okay, well, I guess our tribe's at war now, and so it's like everybody all in, because like you gotta protect the tribe, and play your part to protect the tribe. So yeah, I don't know.
I think you're right that it's bringing out the shadow, and that's what I'm talking about. It's like if we go about our day and we have some sense of something about us that we're suppressing, and it might not be a conscious sense, it's just that there's an awareness that this is not part of me. And then all of a sudden, in a social context, it becomes okay to integrate that thing with yourself. All of a sudden, this thing that you were holding back, it's like, go ahead, let that be part of you. There's a real strong urge to reach out and integrate that thing, because it's almost curiosity. It's like, wait a minute, why was I suppressing this thing? You can almost forget minute to minute why something isn't part of you. I feel like people kind of have a fascination with like the parts of themselves that they know they don't want to be parts of themselves, but they forget why they're not part of them. And when you have the opportunity to indulge in that, it's so tempting. And that kind of online feeding frenzy thing that you're talking about is a perfect example where like, I'm not supposed to beat up on people. I'm not supposed to blame people. I'm not supposed to do these things. And you go about your day and you're thinking about these in every little interaction in a lot of cases. And then this opportunity comes to indulge in all those things. And who wouldn't want to take that?
Right. Yeah. It is indulgence. And I mean, I can't remember who I was talking with this about this with, but I was saying something about like, one time my friend Scott and I had a funny little interaction, and I think I'm maybe this is just my version of it, but I think I tend to have a pretty like nice guy persona, we were, Scott and I were doing this tour together, and we played a show with somebody who was just sort of, I don't know, maybe I can't even remember the exact event, but it was somebody who was like maybe a little bit obnoxious or was breaking all these rules of sort of like, show etiquette and just whatever it was. And the end of the night comes, we load our stuff into the car and we're driving to the next place, or wherever we're staying. And there's this sort of like moment of silence in the car where it's like we're sort of both thinking the same thing. And he said something like, just go for it, just go for it. What's on your mind, And then I like, whatever it was, I don't think it was particularly mean, but it was just this sort of like, I kind of unloaded my sort of negative thoughts about that my, interaction with whoever we were like playing a show with or whatever the case was. And it did feel like an indulgence, and like I felt like I was sort of like eating dessert, and this is what I was talking about recently with somebody, where I was saying, like if you're like talking shit about somebody, it does, like it does sort of feel good in a way, and it's like, but we don't want to admit that that's like a good feeling, but it's kind of like, I guess it's this sort of light side versus dark side in Star Wars or something. It's like, like there's a balance. Most people have a balance. Some people sort of represent the who have really indulged and sort of represent as a symbol the dark side, and other people represent the good. So it's like this sort of battle. Most people are kind of in the middle. And, and I think most of us feel that way, I guess, unless you don't have a conscience or, don't see people as anything more than like an extension of yourself or something. But, we have this sort of like equalizing force of that goes against that negative impulse, or that indulgent impulse that's called ethics, like, like to break it a little bit, to break a taboo or something, it feels good. It's like feels like eating a piece of chocolate cake or something, you know. And all the like the dopamine receptors are getting their hits or whatever, and but if all you eat is chocolate cake, then it loses. I mean, you're still getting the dopamine thing, but it loses its sort of like specialty, effect. And if that becomes a thing, you start to see all the negative effects of that over time. Which is why. Sorry, the dog's walking past the microphone right now for everybody listening. He's gonna lay down in the corner and just breathe heavily. But it's like if you indulge constantly in the things that we sort of consider to be negative or indulgent, and you don't have that other thing kind of tempering it or pulling that other gravitational force pulling it the other way, then you start to see all these like decaying effects, and I think, I mean, I know of examples of that personally, of just people who've been sort of indulging in negativity for so long that they're later in life just looks pretty sad, and sort of corroded, I guess you could say.
I think there's a part of that that's a good instinct. Like the part that makes negativity so appealing, I feel, is exposing hypocrisy. Because sometimes we can get into positions where we're indulging all the time and we don't recognize it.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it's an eternal part of culture, even good culture, that there's some aspect of it that's indulgent, and there's some part of it that has gone too far, and people can't realize it because they're so in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to have that urge to rebel a little bit, to test those boundaries, to figure out where we have lost track of our indulgences. Because if you don't test those things, if you don't check, is this really wrong? Is this something that I should actually not indulge in? Or is this something that's perfectly healthy, maybe in small doses, maybe in large doses? I think there's a lot of progress that's made, which is pushing boundaries and questioning things that maybe had a good intention at one point, but over time they got corrupted, or they no longer apply, or something changed with them, where these things that we just kind of accepted as rules for life and we accepted as part of ourselves, it needed to be purged or it needed to be changed. Now, as a consequence of that, of course, sometimes you're going to test a boundary and you're going to find like, oh yeah, that's really a good boundary.
Yeah.
But if you don't have that sense of what is and isn't a good boundary, you're just going to test anything, whether it's good or bad.
Right. And if you test it, maybe you don't have a good way of determining whether like this is a good boundary or not.
Yeah,
like,
that's what I mean. Yeah, you're going to keep testing it. Like you got your answer, and all of the info is coming to you saying that like this boundary is worthwhile, and your testing came up with results, and you're just ignoring your results, and you're keeping the test going. You keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and you don't know when to stop.
Yeah.
I feel like that happens to people because you get in these situations, like you said, feeding frenzies, and especially when it's happening collectively. So maybe one person had to say something and speak up in order to get feedback. And on a one-by-one basis, maybe you can achieve something through calling someone out or pointing someone out. But when a whole crowd of people starts piling on, each individual person is going to get something different out of that. There's no way for the initial person to address everyone collectively to the same level. They're each going to need their own individual response.
Right.
And so that person who's the victim of the feeding frenzy is never going to be able to pull themselves out of it, because more people are going to continue to put on their own unique perspectives and their own needs for a response. And as that grows, their ability to address those people that are attacking them diminishes, because they can't possibly address all of them at the same time.
Yeah.
And it just becomes this runaway effect. And that happens over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And it's so much more common when we have all these amazing powers of communicating online with everyone all at once and publicizing everything. And as people become more and more comfortable making their life public, they open themselves up to all these extra attacks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we were talking about the effects of the shadow, and I was thinking how this leads to some absurd consequences.
Yeah.
One of my favorite articles I read a few years ago was talking about how technology is making us all more Amish.
I like that.
And the reason why,
Sentiment.
the reason why is that the Amish don't just have a ban on technology in general, but most communities have to accept a piece of technology on a case-by-case basis. They all have to get together and agree mutually that this technology is beneficial for people.
Right.
And it doesn't push them away from each other, because it's all about what actually draws the community together. And if it separates the community, it's rejected. If it has the opportunity to bring the community closer together, they can use it.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of people have had to make rules like no phones at the table or things like that around technology, because it has such a big effect on socialization that we now all have to think about what's an acceptable time and place for technology. Even if we have this creeping sense of more and more technology is more socially acceptable, the point is that we're thinking about it, and that we're choosing when it's acceptable.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like, it's because of, I think, like maybe the rapidity of the like the advancement of technology and how accessible it is to everybody, all of a sudden, or at least within a short amount of time. It's like taking like the hundreds or even thousands of years that it took before to sort of develop these ethical systems across multiple generations, and squashing it into, like, you know, the tail end of one generation and the beginning of a new one. So, like, you know, like, there have been all these rules developed like that. Yeah, like put your phone down when we're eating dinner around the table, or if we're having an important discussion, or you know, I always think of it because I work in a coffee shop. If somebody walks up to the counter, there's this already this sense, you know, and it shows up in culture a lot too currently, like oh, the guy who comes to the counter and he's on the phone and telling the person behind the counter what he wants and blowing them off, that guy's sort of considered an asshole, you know. So like there's this whole sort of like I get, well, maybe it's not centered around morality, but more around like aesthetics. But it's sort of the aesthetic side of ethics, you know. It's like you're not like evil if you're doing this, but you're kind of an asshole, you know.
Yeah.
Which are, you know, they're cousins, but they're not exactly the same thing. So yeah, it's like there's this whole new sort of set of like ethical aesthetics that's arising around technology in a very short amount of time. And so it's like we're all sort of like, it's, you know, because ethics is a social practice and system. We're having to sort of bounce all of these ideas off of each other in a in a short amount of time, whereas before, you know, we're not like really evolved to do that, but we're also, because we have evolved to think like ethically, and it's like we're actually very adept at it, even though this is like a brand new sort of thing that we have to negotiate rules around, because we've evolved over such a long period of time to be to have ethics because of tribes and, you know, survival and all of that stuff. We happen to do this around technology really quickly, it seems like, you know.
I think in some ways too, you could make an argument that we've had to let certain things go to gain that ability to adapt. Some things, I think, are changing maybe more slowly than they have in the past, like language. Language is like the first big technology, I would say. Mm-hmm. Like people's capability to communicate and put complex ideas into words with each other, it's something that we had to invent. We weren't born just knowing how to speak. Right. And we had to apply it scientifically in all sorts of different ways, and we had to come to consensus socially about how to use language and what means what. And for pretty much all of human history, it's been changing and evolving a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And if you read things that are really old, you go back a few hundred years and it gets difficult, even in English, to understand what people are saying because language has changed so much over time. However, you go back the last couple hundred years, you go to like modern English, and everything has been more and more static. And I feel like in a lot of ways we've reduced our ability to put complex thoughts into language in everyday cases, and people are maybe a little bit less attuned to subtleties in language than they used to be, because that focus that used to go to language and developing our sense of communication and changing those things went to using other technologies that we use to communicate, like non-linguistic, maybe things like phones, which are mostly like picture based, and like there's a lot of focus on the interface, and all those things are in a way a language. Knowing how to use a laptop and a phone and all the other computerized interfaces you use, those are all in some sense a certain language that you're using with that machine.
Sure.
And so you've had to kind of divide your linguistic ability among all these different interfaces when people used to focus it more on person-to-person communication, or maybe a specific trade or something like that.
I'll give a good example of what you're talking about, which is I saw my friend John Letts in the coffee shop the other day, and he was saying that he gives like music lessons to kids, and he was saying that he was talking to some girl. And he said, I can't give you lessons on like bass lessons this day of the week, but I know another guy who can, and here's his phone number, and you can just call him up and ask him for bass lessons or whatever on this day. And the girl, who was maybe in like early high school or something like that, said, I have to call him, and that was like a totally like, I don't know, it was like anachronistic or something, I have to call this person, and because she couldn't text or email or something like that, so she had to like give somebody a call. So I think that's a good example of that. It's like that aspect of sort of like verbal communication has kind of cratered in a sense, but maybe it's because of, I don't know like where you were going with that, but maybe it's because there are more efficient ways of communication. Pictures with 1,000 words, I guess, is like maybe one way to put it. But you were saying that you think that that's slowed down. Is that right?
Well, what I was trying to relate it to is you talking about our amazing ability to adapt to all this changing technology. And I think that what we've done is we've just taken capabilities that we've had for a long time and kind of applied them to different fields, where we're using those same capabilities that let us develop this incredibly complex language, and we're just applying them into different areas in order to like use different types of technology, just like language. Language is just a special case of technology, just like this idea that Freud had of the shadow, and Jung said, okay, like that is a thing, but it's part of a category of a whole bunch of different things. All these different tools we have, like language and all the other technologies, they're all part of a category of things that people have been adapting to for a really long time.
Right.
And so it is amazing, but in other ways, it just shows us those capabilities that we've had and like our ancestors had for so long, and it helps us understand how they were able to create what they created when we look at our ability to adapt to all sorts of different things.
Yeah.
But the thing that was most interesting to me is just how paradoxical it all gets, because it doesn't always push things where you think it does. Like I was saying, with technology making us more Amish, what I was arguing to begin with is like social media is making us more Catholic, because as we put ourselves in these positions where we're communicating with people about group identities, we become more and more focused on those things that aren't part of our group, those things that are negative. We kind of become more and more focused on sin, and sin has been redefined in social media. It's not just classical sin, and that's a part of that spectrum too, but there are all sorts of things in whatever group you happen to be a part of that you're not supposed to believe or think. And it can be really specific. Maybe you're part of like a musical genre, like you're really into punk, and if you love Winger, people are going to make fun of you because they're like, that is not what our group likes. Like, how can you like that music? That's ridiculous.
Like Winger?
Winger.
What's Winger?
Okay, this is like an old school reference. So, some band that people would make fun of in a music community. Just pick one.
Okay.
This is like a Beavis and Butthead reference.
Right. Okay. You're like a little bit ahead of my time. For me it'd be like, oh yeah, okay, you like this kind of stuff, then therefore it's totally unacceptable to like Bright Eyes or Dashboard Confessional or something.
Yeah.
Okay, but like Winger. All right, gotcha.
It's not like a band that I ever think about.
Yeah.
But it's like a cartoonish like band to make fun of.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, take it as my advanced age here coming out.
No, I hope that wasn't insulting. I just
no,
it's like,
not at all.
It's funny. It's funny that they're like we have different like reference points for the same like concept. You know, I don't know. It's funny.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay, just to go back to what you're saying. So like, so like technology is like making us more Catholic. So if you belong to a particular group, then it sort of implies a lot of ego identification and a lot of that sort of like shadow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure I was like tracking with you and understand what you were saying.
So what I'm talking about here is how you get involved in these groups and you become so defined by the things that you're not.
Right.
And these things pile on top of each other. So I'm coming back to this idea of the shadow, like how it's not just that the shadow is what you're not, it's that those parts of yourself that you're really aware of that you're not, in a lot of cases, are as what you think of the shadow. And those are the things that are most interesting to you. You could come up with a million things that you're not. You could come up with, like, I'm not whatever, this race, this culture, this religion. You can come up with all those things, but a lot of times maybe you don't even think about them. Right. And they're not really that important to you. But then you can come up with other things like maybe it's your political identity. I'm not liberal, I'm not conservative. And you start projecting all sorts of things onto that category. Mm-hmm. And that's one of those things that gets involved in Jungian psychology, that idea of projecting, where any part of yourself that's not you, you will start to make connections between those things. And they might be completely disconnected. Like let's say it's like politics and music. Like you're like, I am not conservative and I hate country music. And like those people love country music, and there's something about it. There's something about country music that's wrong because it attracts conservatives to it.
Yeah.
And you start to project like all sorts of things that you don't like about yourself or that you don't want to be part of yourself on that, and be like, you know what, conservatives, like, they just drink all the time and beat their wives and they're just deadbeats, and like country music shows all that stuff. It's all in the lyrics. It's all true.
Yeah.
And it's just exactly what I think about all these rednecks that defines them. And maybe the reason why you're focusing on that is because you have this sort of like Catholic guilt about it, about like your own whatever it is your misogyny. You have some kind of tendency toward these things that you're trying to suppress in yourself. And maybe it's a really tangential thing, like you're not gonna like do these things that you accuse these other people of, but they're tangentially collected. Like you want to like act out, you want to be physically involved in the world, and you sit behind a cubicle all day and you have no visceral connection to it, and you miss that. And so you create these caricatures of people as being just totally driven by instinct and emotion and all these things that you don't have in your own life. Mm-hmm. And you turn this into like these like animalistic people that just act out every impulse. Mm-hmm. And you don't have that ability to do that, and you don't have the choice because of the choices you've made in your life, and it becomes your caricature of the ultimate shadow. And somehow it's driving you though, because you want part of it.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's a really important like aspect of that conversation about the shadow is the difference between making you know making yourself aware of that, that tendency or the impulse within yourself to, or your willingness to associate yourself with these, like, this set of sort of like quote unquote negative feelings or negative viewpoints or something like that, and the act of playing that out, physically with your body and your mind and your words, and I guess mind is kind of in a different category, but you understand what I'm saying, I think. So, yeah, like, you can sort of accept that that's the feeling, and then, but that's sort of like what, like the freedom of speech and common law and all of that stuff is rests on that division between like thinking or saying something and acting it out, and people doing what I guess they refer to as like shadow work does have some, I think, does have some criticisms in that culture and that sphere against it, which says, the more that you focus, it's kind of like what you were talking about with sin earlier in the conversation. The more that you focus on this sort of like darkness or negativity or something, then it sort of plays into like the rule of attraction. What you put out into the universe is like what you'll get back or whatever. So that's like one of the criticisms of this, like doing work and being able to articulate where let's say you have a negative reaction to somebody doing something, you don't quite know exactly why you have a negative feeling towards someone, but Jordan Peterson talks about this in the context of, in a lot of mythos, there's this dangerous being, this dangerous creature sitting on top of a pile of gold, a dragon sitting on top of a pile of gold, like Smaug in The Hobbit, or the Sphinx having the answer to, he's like this terrible creature, is like a beast and a man, barring the way to freedom, and so there's, that's kind of part of the conversation about the shadow that refers to, this like creature, this horrible thing being guarding this really valuable thing, So it's like you have a negative feeling about somebody, and you don't know why yet, but it's somehow like mirroring something within yourself that you see. It's like that projection, right? It's like you see the potential for this like horrible thing being played out in somebody else, and you see it and you recognize it because you recognize it within yourself, just not consciously. So like, like the shadow work is basically finding the way that I heard it described is like you have a pile of 10,000 computer cords, and they're all jumbled up and mixed up because it's so complex. From the moment we start identifying as anything as separate from the world around us, that the creation of the shadow begins, from that point. Like when we're, I don't know what it is, like 18 months maybe, we say, I'm a boy, it's like I'm a girl, whatever you are, like, and so you start sort of developing that shadow so basically we were talking a couple of weeks ago about this concept of like something that's irreducibly complex, and you talk about in terms of like, well, maybe you could talk about that in a little bit, but something that's irreducibly complex, and the shadow is, I think, essentially in that category. It's irreducibly complex because from the moment that we can conceive of something as, separate or a part of ourselves, that things have parts, we start developing this thing in the background that's not those things, and so like doing shadow work, they say, like in terms of like self-knowledge and learning yourself and why you have particular reactions to the world you're in and the environment that you're interacting with. It's kind of like taking one of those, this huge jumbled pile of chords, and pulling one of those chords out and finding the end of it, or like what it's plugged into maybe, or if it is even plugged in, it's like you just are like pulling this chord out and you figure out where the end of it is, and that's like an ongoing process, and like I was saying earlier, like the criticism of that is the more you focus on sort of like negativity, darkness, then the more that kind of like plays out in your life, which I think is just from sort of like a plausibility perspective, it kind of makes sense, It's like, yeah, okay, it's like externally plausible, but I do think that that there is, first of all, a difference. The response to that would be that there's a difference between recognizing and acting it out. And if you have that sort of like capacity to intercept your impulse before it plays out, which I think is kind of in some ways the same thing as the capacity to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, like if you have like empathy, right, then that division is going to remain distinct, here I have this impulse, or even if you play it out, you can say, here's when I decided to indulge and eat that, like whatever, that third piece of chocolate cake or whatever. That was the moment, But if you don't have that impulse control, then they're one and the same, So,
I want to go back to that metaphor you're using of pulling cords out. I really like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing you were talking about is the law of attraction.
Mm-hmm.
I would call this more the law of focus. Mm. It's like you're surrounded by everything. Whatever you focus on, that's what you'll see.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean necessarily that all those other things aren't around you, but obviously if you're in a room, visually your focus goes on something, that's what you notice. And then you have peripheral things around that.
Right.
But like in a larger sense, in your mind, you have a much bigger room. You have a lot more information than you see visually in a room, and you have the ability to focus on any one of those things that exist in your mind. Mm. And you will see that thing, and you will see the peripheral things. Mm. And as I understand the way memory works, memory is associative. So whenever we pull up a memory, we also pull up all those things that we associate with that memory. Mm. And the deeper we go and the more we think about it, the more tangential things we pull up. So that shadow, it kind of works the same way. We choose a focus, we pull on this cord, and we end up getting all the things that are wrapped around that cord. Mm. Right? Just like if you have this tangle of 1,000 cords and you pull on one, you're going to get a lot more than that one string that you pulled on. You're going to see everything move in a completely unpredictable way.
Right.
So there's like a sense in which we can't just pull on that cord, because we go through these experiences and we go through that and like, I'm going to zero in on this thing. I'm just going to pull this cord, whatever it takes. And there are side effects. There are things that happen. Mm. And if you have this goal, you as a person, you can't just pull on the cord. You actually have to map out a path. You can't just focus on one individual thing. You have to look at that cord and you have to see everywhere it leads in order to untangle it. Like, right. You need to be able to have this capacity to see not just where you are and where you're going, but all the things that are tangled up between you and that in order to get to that point, in order to untangle it. And there is a real contemplative necessity for people. Like, people need to be able to map out where they are and where they're going, that path from where they see themselves to where they see their goals are.
Yeah.
And it's not a straight line. It never is. It's not a matter of just saying, I want to be here, this is what I need to do, period. It's a matter of taking it step by step and untangling things. And what we were talking about earlier with the internet, it's kind of a way of obfuscating that untangling process. Mm-hmm. Like what happens there is you see a goal and it kind of gets reduced to a simple interaction. Like technology and the interfaces and languages. I mean, you could say this even about English itself. It's like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that like your language changes your mind and it changes the way you think.
Yeah.
Technology changes the way you think too. You can argue this hypothesis and you can argue the specifics of, but you can't argue that what you think about changes your mental processes. I mean, like as a general principle, that is like absolutely true. Yeah. Your mind is your mind, and where your thoughts go, that is what builds your mind. So anyway, we get into these situations where we have the ability to think in very goal-oriented ways, and it looks like we can go there in a straight line. It looks like everything is a clear path. It looks like nothing's tangled up. There are no side effects. The people who are telling us that there are, those are just these shadows. These are these enemies. Like when you start casting shadows on everything that looks like an obstacle, you start blocking out from your point of view everything that looks like it's in direct line of you and your goal, and you just ignore it. You create this point of view where you only see the things that you want to see. You only see the things that look like they confirm what you want to be true. It's that idea of confirmation bias.
Yeah, and married to the law of unintended consequences, right? Which is that, if you do one thing, it has a particular negative effect that you weren't expecting. It's like pulling on the cord and it moves 100 other cords because it's tangled at some point, and it's like pulling these other ones, and then to resolve that, you have to do another thing which creates other unintended consequences. And I mean, this is a good just from like saying this from sort of like the libertarians that I listened to for years and years, like they would say, government programs are essentially that what you're describing, which is that thought that, okay, we tend to be like goal oriented. So if I do this and do this and do this, that progression will lead to this expected outcome, right? And then it's causing all these other sort of like unexpected consequences, of that same action. It's like the action you can, that's represented in your mind as this perfect progression, this plus this equals this, has all these other variables that you're not expecting, mm-hmm. and then it makes these other problems, and then you try to like fix those with doing the same, having the same thing, the same like goal-oriented focus on that. Okay, now here's a new problem. Let's solve it. This plus this equals this outcome. And it just grows and grows like this tree, that that grows into this whole tangled mess of, unintended consequences and a huge pile of, computer cords that one of which you pull on to try to fix or solve, pull that thing out, then has all these other consequences. Yeah, it's the same pile of cords, or is the tree, is the,
Yeah. And that's why a lot of these simplistic ideologies become so popular. I think it's something like communism, where it's like we have a scientific understanding of the progress of civilization. These are the terms. This is what we need to do. If we follow these guidelines and work toward this goal, like we will be doing the right thing. No matter what the consequences, no matter what the side effects, if we have the big picture in mind, it's for the greater good.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so like, yeah, I guess that sort of like brings us back to the sort of the integration part, right? If like, fine, if you want to have, like, think logically in those steps, this plus this equals this, then if you want the desired outcome, then integrating let's say these other elements, these other attributes of that process, like saying, okay, if I pull this cord, let's factor in that it's going to move these other things. Then it becomes a stronger system. It's kind of like that. You and I have talked about this, like chaos monkey before, right? Where
Chaos Monkey is where Netflix has programs to randomly shut down their servers. So they attack themselves all the time in order to understand how to be resilient to those kinds of attacks.
Right.
Like if you're in a situation where you're never being attacked, you're going to be sloppy, you're going to get weak, you're just going to assume that everything's going to be okay, and then that moment when something goes wrong, you're not going to be prepared. So there's a big advantage to running those kinds of fire drills and responding to problems, and not just pretend problems, but you get into computers and you can actually create a real problem and you can have to respond to it. So it's a fire drill to the next level. And I feel like that's going to be the future of technology. Isn't things where everything is expected to work right all the time. We're still kind of in that a little bit. Mm-hmm. We still have systems that are set up to just kind of assume perfect situations. But we're going to need to have Chaos Monkey in every piece of technology. Everything is going to have to be attacked all the time and develop resistance to those kinds of attacks, because as technology becomes more and more a part of the world, we don't want to develop a single point of failure where so there's a electromagnetic pulse and all our satellite communications are down and now nobody can get food or society can't function. You don't want to have that happen, right?
Right.
You want to have a system that's resilient.
You want to build in a generator that will automatically kick on when the power goes out, right? Yeah. So it's like, or at least that sets off like an alarm or a light or something. It's like, hey, the power just went off. Text your phone, or something. Yeah. Like building other things into it. That's
so that's like the technological version of, in some ways, the shadow. We're coming back to that same thing. It's like we have this necessity to build this negative force into our technology in order to make it stronger. It's like we need this adversarial process.
Yeah.
Because we live in a world where conflict is real, and it's going to be a long time before we change that fact around.
Yeah.
And what I was saying about ideologies, there's a lot of ideologies that have this ideal that if we just follow this process, there won't be any more conflict. We can just have perfect peace. Everything will be good. We just need to get to that point. My argument is that's not even a good point. We want conflict. We want it to be controlled. We want Chaos Monkey is like an ideal version. It's like this program that we choose to run. We choose to attack ourselves to make ourselves stronger.
Yeah.
It's like the best kind of fighting is fencing. It's people who are going into a mutually agreed situation in order to make themselves better, and they're enjoying it. They're perfecting their craft. And it's like fighting without the possibility of real death. It's real injury.
Yeah.
You're protecting yourself, but you're also advancing your ability to defend yourself.
Right. And that being the ideal situation. One thing that I've noticed, not to get off on too much of a tangent, but I've noticed that since let's just say since some of the approved, since some of the gates have fallen in terms of like internet ease of access to information, and there being, there is this big pushback against like the people who've been in control of like disseminating information are having really negative reaction to people being able to access whatever information. And there's kind of we're seeing this push to, for censorship and stuff, even with people who control the means of information that make information really accessible to people, right? There's sort of like the censorship. These are bad ideas. These are, good ideas. We're standing in the way of this, classification of bad ideas coming over the hill, so we need to put up a wall to, like, it's just the new gatekeepers, like you see this kind of with, and maybe I shouldn't go too far into this, but like Google, Facebook, Twitter, like these people who have a lot of power and whose job description is dissemination of information and ease of access to different ideas and stuff, are kind of maybe getting this like I don't know, like I don't know if it's like drunk with power or something, like in this position of like, oh, well, we now have this responsibility to determine what ideas are acceptable and what are not for public discourse. There's like bad people out there who have this, power that are having influence, it's influence. And so we need to shut them down, It's like, that's so contrary to that idea, but, or, to their like job description. But, this, I have found that since there's been this sort of like conflict, that now there's this conflict between people who are reaping the rewards, reaping the benefits of the dissemination of information, this explosion of productivity, creativity, and stuff in this kind of free market of ideas and free speech and stuff. And there's this new kind of battle going on, which and I have found even between people that seem to be like friends and allies within that, like people that I know, and people that I listen to who are like influential to my way of thinking and stuff. There's this broader, array of ideas and viewpoints, and people are very strongly arguing their points and even fighting. No, fighting's not the right word, but like that are even debating amongst themselves, and that's kind of like the dream, Yeah. That's kind of the dream. It's like, oh, it's actually happening now, and I'm observing it in real time, like in my Twitter feed. It's like there are these people who are kind of on like one side of an argument. It seems kind of binary, which is what I think the people in positions of power want us to think it is. Mm-hmm. It's like the Republicans and the Democrats. It's the free market people versus the controlled system people. It's like that's really like that simplification that you're talking about on social media is very useful for people who get to control the conversation, because they can just say, we don't like this, A or B. We don't like B, so A is the way to go, and B gets shut out of the conversation, right? But this actual, broad, diverse set of opinions that are sort of like warring with each other creates a better world, for more people. It's actually the utilitarian, like paradise in a way. I say that guardedly, but like that's actually the utilitarian paradise that those people are trying to achieve by controlling it. Like the conversation in itself is, and the this sort of like battling out of ideas. And for influence, and whoever's making the best arguments with the best rhetoric, and or who's ever making the best rhetoric with the worst ideas, or whatever the case may be, like there is this diverse, this like colorful spectrum of like ideas and stuff being bandied about, and with a lot of positive effect, which is I at least to my mind, that's like this golden egg, It's like
I love it.
And you don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. You know?
I don't think you can. I think what you can do is you can change which opinions and which conversations get mass acceptance and mass viewings.
Yeah.
The conversation is going to happen in every direction. You can't really suppress the exchange of information. You can maybe slow it down in some ways or another, but in the age that we live in, there is more communication, even with the harshest censorship, than there has been at any point in history.
Yeah.
So you can go to something like North Korea, and I don't know much about North Korea, but I would bet that there is a lot more subversive discussion going on in unrecorded ways, person to person, than there would have been 3,000 years ago in the past, when they maybe had theoretically more freedom. They didn't have these same mechanisms of control and authority, but they didn't have the capacity to have these discussions. Now, I feel like authority is freaking out a little bit. Like they're panicking because they're like, there's so much stuff going on, it's really hard to control. They manage to control a little bit about what gets broadcast, what gets put on major networks, all these things.
Yeah.
You can control that, but the conversation is happening despite what they want to do. And so they've kind of accepted that. It's like people who have power live a little bit in the future. I feel like when you're talking about Google or Facebook or something like that, what's happening there is that these companies are so advanced, they're planning for what's happening 10 years from now. But the future is not set. The future is not absolute. Right. And they have to work really hard to make sure that things work out into this future that they believe in and that they think is the optimal one. And so they get focused on creating that future. They know it's a possibility. They know it's not certain. And they do everything they can to make their optimal future come true because they're living so far in the future. They know how things can turn out in all sorts of different directions.
Right.
Maybe not any individual, but as a whole, as an organization, the amount of information they have available, they can make these predictions with pretty good certainty. I mean, we have artificial intelligences now that can predict all sorts of things, and like they're not going to give you like the one true answer, but they're going to take 1 billion points of data and say this is a really likely outcome of that, and people have access to that now in ways they never did.
Right. And if I know this is another tangent, and I hope that's okay, but I see this parallel between what you're describing and like I used to hear all these stories when I was young about Christians in oppressive environments, right, that are being persecuted and under all these different kinds of circumstances, right, and how Christianity and communist China and ancient where like Rome or something are being suppressed and knocked down, and I think that an interesting thing about that is that it's kind of built, like they're kind of built into the essence of that ideology is this sort of like we're going, first of all, making predictions, being able to sort of see into the future, right? It's like prophecy, and like Jesus is going to come back at this certain time. It's like it's sort of based on some sort of like prophetic things. And also built into it is this kind of like subversion and anti-establishment, thought, right? So, but I mean, it can like it expands beyond that. But those are some of the fundamentals of it, right? If you have that built in, right, to the system, like Google, let's say, for instance, like is able to predict all of these things about the future, right? It's kind of like, and they're also saying, but they've also created this broad dissemination of information. So it's kind of like Google the company Google, it's like they they created this sort of like system which they're trying to now maintain control of. It's like, but the system is greater than just the people who make up their specific company and the shares and the shareholders and all of that stuff. So it's kind of like they're the Catholic Church now, and the ideas are greater than the Catholic Church, and it's broader and it's more accessible than just themselves, or their institution, which is like huge, So probably gonna end up on some like watch list or something. As I put it on the internet, but do you understand what I'm saying though?
Yeah. So when they establish the Church of Google in the future, this will be considered like an original text, and this will be translated into 1,000 different languages. This podcast
using the Google Translate application.
Right. Google will translate it. It won't be a text the way we know. It will be machine language, binary. I'm talking about not the text as the language, but the text as the ones and zeros that make up this podcast.
Beautiful.
Will be considered holy by future artificial intelligences, and saying that like these people were predicting that Google would be bigger than the company, it would outgrow it, it would lose its ability to be controlled by people, and it would forge its own destiny.
Yeah.
Eventually, at some point, the process kind of becomes self-promoting and self-controlling. And all of the efforts of this corporation that spawned this worldwide network of computers and code wasn't able to maintain their control. No matter how hard they tried, they got involved in politics, they got involved in businesses and all sorts of different angles. They spread their tentacles in every direction they could, but there's only so much human managers can conceive of. And when you start pulling these cords, no matter how good you are at mapping, eventually you're going to reach this point where things are so tangled that you're not going to be able to predict the future.
Yeah. Beautiful. And yeah, we'll do I think that's a good place to end at least this part of this. This has been a really great conversation, and I hope we can come back at some point and do some a little more exploration of currencies and stuff. And so I'm going to say that this is the end of this this first part of this very first interview. Evan Zimmerman is our guest, and Evan, thanks for being on the show. And I'm sure we'll do it again, if not frequently. And thanks for being here. Thanks everybody for listening. If you haven't already, if you've made it this far, God bless you. And hit the like and subscribe buttons. And thanks everybody. Have a good time.